The following are 4 tools that I use to more efficiently sand carbon fiber, 3D printed plastics, epoxy resin, and wood. I bought all of these on Amazon, nothing sent for free, nothing sponsored, just an overview, a demo, and my opinion. Tool number 1 is a random orbit sander. So this particular one is a 5-inch Black+Decker. It's around $29 on Amazon. The pros here are that the machine does pretty much all of the work. You've got fast material removal, and it evenly covers a lot of ground. There's also some built-in dust collection that works pretty well on this one. The cons are that there's relatively low control with that random orbit dual action, so it's best for flat surfaces. Also, you do need a special sandpaper. It has to have that hook and loop backing in order to attach to the sander. Tool number 2 is a quarter sheet palm sander. This particular one is a DeWALT. It's about $44 or $49 if you want the carrying bag. The pros are here that you don't need any special paper. It doesn't need to have Velcro or any sort of adhesive. You just take your standard sheet of sandpaper and cut it into 4 sheets. Also, the clips on this particular model hold the paper really, really well. For this type of sander, you get more control than the random orbit because it's single action, so there's not as much vibration there. So this one's good for projects that have more of a 3-dimensional shape, not just flat surfaces. You still get that relatively fast material removal, and you do have the option of using the dust collection or not. The tool comes with a punch that you can add the holes into your paper if you want to use the dust collection. I've noticed though that the dust collection on this one isn't that great even with the holes punched, so it's a lot better if you add a vacuum on there. So the cons are that you still get a good bit of vibration, and of course it's loud, especially if you also have the vacuum on there to get the good dust collection. This one also seems to be slightly more prone to uneven sanding when you're working on large flat surfaces. For the power sanding category overall, you're going to have a lot faster material removal with less effort and fatigue, but on the other hand, it's loud. You have typically a higher initial cost. It can also leave swirl marks, and then you have electrical components that can, of course, wear out. Also, it's not safe for wet sanding. These particular tools aren't sealed for use with water, so that's not a recommended option. For me, with large flat surfaces like a tabletop, I'd absolutely go with the random orbit for that even sanding and great dust collection. For more delicate items with edges and organic shapes, the palm sander does offer more versatility and control. If I had to choose just one, I'd go with the palm sander for its versatility, but having both is ideal. Moving on to tool number 3, we're switching over to the hand sanding category. So this one is the Preppin weapon sanding block. It's about $21 on Amazon. So the pros for this are that it's an ergonomic design. This thing is built like a rock, and you have the option of dry or wet sanding. This thing holds the paper flawlessly with very little waste. It's easy to change the paper, and it works with any sandpaper, so you don't need an adhesive or Velcro backing. The only con here is that the cost is relatively high for something that just holds the paper, but the overall value definitely is a 10 out of 10. Tool number 4 is the Perma-Grit sanding block. So this one's around $39 on Amazon. It comes in other shapes and lengths. The pros here are that the grit lasts for ages, so it's supposed to be thousands of times longer than sandpaper, so you're going to have less waste than when you're using that disposable sandpaper. The abrasive is mounted on an aluminum block, which keeps your edges straight and square. And this one is reversible, so you have coarse on one side and medium grit on the other side, so you don't have to stop and switch paper when moving between those grits. The biggest con for me here is that even the fine grit is relatively coarse. It's about a 120 grit. Also, there's a relatively high cost, and it's not as comfortable to hold because of its shape and the grit being on both sides. Overall, for the sanding block category, the pros are that it's quiet and cheap. You also have the most control because it's the least aggressive. The cons are that it's slow and strenuous. My recommendation, absolutely get the Preppin weapon. It's excellent. The Perma-Grit products are great quality, and I use mine regularly for fast material removal by hand, but it's more a luxury extra, whereas the Preppin weapon is an essential. I wish I'd bought mine years ago. So that's the overview. Now let's do a demo to test how well these actually perform in comparison to each other. For this test, I have a piece of plywood that I've marked into sections so that I will sand with each tool. I have the same 3M 150 grit paper on the palm sander and the Preppin weapon. The random orbit sander also has a 150 grit. It's a different brand that I'm testing out, so it's not 100% scientific, but it will give you an idea of how these tools work. I labeled each section with a pen and used that as a rough guide for when to stop, just trying to sand off the ink of that label for each section. First up is the random orbit sander. So this didn't remove material quite as fast as I expected, but it was easy to use. I'm not applying pressure, just letting the tool do most of the work. And the removal was very even, so my surface that I'm left with is quite flat. The dust collection was also working really well, just with the bag on the tool. I didn't have a vacuum attached. It still took quite a while to get through that ink, but the amount of effort is very low, so a little bit of time, not a lot of effort. This was easy to use on the flat surface, however, just for demonstration purposes, I tried it on the side of the wood, and it was not comfortable for this, and it wasn't doing an even job. Unsurprisingly, that's not really what this was meant for. I think you could get away with it if you kind of play around with the technique, but it's not the best tool for the job. Next up is that quarter sheet palm sander with the 150 grit paper, and I have punched in the holes, so the dust collection should be working. This actually seemed to be sanding kind of faster than the random orbit. I'm not sure if I was applying more pressure by mistake since I'm more familiar with this tool, I've had it longer, or it could be that I was just doing it so unevenly that it seemed like it was working better. I sanded at this for a while till I got through that ink, but when I checked my results, one side was most definitely lower than the other, so I did not do a very good job of sanding this smooth and flat. If I were more careful, I could get better results with that, but the random orbit I didn't have to try, it just worked fine without having to think about whether I was keeping it perfectly flat or not. The dust collection on this DeWALT one is not nearly as good. I don't know if that's due to the design of this brand or if it's because it's a palm sander versus a random orbit. I was getting a lot of dust left on there and I kept having to sweep off the paper and the surface in order to keep that clear. For comparison purposes again, I'm testing this on the side of the board and it's just fine for that. It's not uncomfortable to use on a straight edge. You can also use this on rounded shapes for sanding things other than just flat surfaces. Checking the bag after this section was completed, there was quite a bit of dust collected, so it is working. It's just not quite as thorough as the random orbit Black+Decker. Of course, you can just hook a vacuum up to this. Now, I didn't have a connector that would adapt the vacuum I have to this proprietary DeWALT connection, so I just 3D printed one with some TPU filament that connects these very well. So now I can test this with the best situation for dust collection. Adding the vacuum makes a huge difference. There is so much less dust left on the surface. I'm not having to constantly stop and sweep it with my broom. So for the palm sander, definitely want to hook that up to a vacuum to get the best result. And then when we're moving on to the Preppin weapon, I have again the 150 3M sandpaper on this. It's very comfortable to hold and the sandpaper stays on perfectly. I have never had an edge come up. Same with the quarter sheet palm sander. Those clips work really, really well. So with both of those tools, you don't have to worry about trying to keep your sandpaper wrapped around a block or anything. This is also quite good for edges, and you have the benefit here of being able to switch to finer grit papers if you want to polish that edge up to a finer grit. You still have the downside of hand sanding where you do have to put in quite a bit of effort, but this tool makes it as comfortable as it could possibly be for this task. To try that Perma-Grit, so I'm starting with the rougher grit and just sanding my way through. And this does take very rough chunks out of it. I think it's a 60 grit equivalent. So then I switched over to the finer grit to smooth that out a bit, and I didn't bother going all the way through the ink. This does take quite a bit of effort, hand sanding versus the power tool, but it does work just fine. And then switching over to sanding the edge, this is the right tool for the job. It works really well for sanding straight edges. At this point, the test was supposed to be done, but I just wasn't happy with how the comparison was done because it wasn't fair having a different brand of sandpaper on the random orbit. So I didn't have a 3M disc for this, but I did have some standard 3M paper. I went ahead and just cut out a circle from that, cut in the dust collection holes, and glued that onto one of the other discs I had. The first glue I tried was contact cement, but this reacted with whatever waterproofing material is on the back of the 3M paper. So I had to switch over to spray adhesive, but that worked great just to stick it over top of the grit of the other brand of sanding disc. Once the glue dried, I attached that onto the random orbit sander and tested it out on that same piece of wood to see if there was a noticeable difference between the 3M versus the Tigershark Goldline brand. Honestly, I thought there would be much more of a difference. I thought that it would now cut as the way I had expected just by having the more expensive sandpaper, but honestly, I couldn't tell the difference It still cut at about the same rate as far as I could tell. There was still lots of dust getting collected, but there was not a notable difference here. So for the power tools at least, this Tigershark Goldline brand seems to work fine. It works just as well as the 3M Precision, best I can tell. I think though for the power sanders, especially for finer grits, the brand of sandpaper just isn't quite as big of a deal because the machine is doing most of the work, whereas when I'm hand sanding, I want the absolute best cut from my sandpaper so I can put in less effort since it is so much more strenuous. Another thing to note is that the hook and loop on this Tigershark brand did work completely fine with the Black+Decker sander. Finally, I tested these out on a piece of carbon fiber that's been coated with an epoxy tabletop coating. I tried all of the tools on it. Pretty much though, you just want the rotary sander for taking down the top surface, and then the palm sander is nice for doing the edges, although in this case the resin on my edges was really thin, so I ended up cutting into the carbon a bit, so that was really better done by hand. The Perma-Grit is really just too rough for this. Even on the finer side, it's just too coarse for something that has such a thin coating. It's definitely not a finishing tool. It's really just for rapid material removal. The Preppin weapon, I was able to of course put a finer grit on there because I can attach whatever grit I need. So that was my primary tool for getting these edges flatted out. Also, I didn't have anything finer than a 220 for the random orbit, so I switched over to the Preppin weapon for the finer grits, and then I also was able to switch to wet sanding with that tool. So of course it's a bit slower, and I do need to get some finer grits for the random orbit, but this does get the job done if you just put in the time. So I rushed the job a bit just to get this done for demonstration purposes. I wet sanded up through 2000 grit, and then I switched over to a random orbit polisher and a couple of different polishing compounds to get this up to somewhat of a decent shine so you can kind of see how it turns out. I'll need to go back though with some of the finer grits and get rid of the last bits of scratches that were left over before it can be brought to a full gloss finish. Final thoughts on this, definitely I would go for the Preppin weapon if you don't yet have a sanding block that you like. Depending on the projects that you're doing, you might want to go with a palm sander for the most versatility, or you can grab a random orbit if you're doing a lot of flat projects such as tabletops. And as for the Perma-Grit block, well, if you've got a lot of straight edges to do, maybe you're working with composites, you need to get things straight and square, then that's a high quality tool that could be really helpful. It also does come in different sizes and shapes that you can check out depending on the types of projects that you're working on.